Dearest listeners, there exists in our glittering world of the ton a peculiar cruelty. Not the cruelty of open mockery, which at least has the virtue of honesty, but rather the quiet cruelty of being perpetually overlooked. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most unexpected tale of a woman who became invisible in the shadow of beauty, and the grieving nobleman who learned that true worth lies not in what dazzles the eye, but in what heals the heart. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. The autumn of 1816 found Miss Amelia Hartley precisely where she had spent most of her 23 years, in a place of comfortable obscurity. The second daughter of the late Reverend Hartley, she had long since accepted her position in the family's constellation. Neither the radiant sun that was her elder sister Lucinda, nor the delightful comet that was her younger sister Sophia, but rather a steady, unremarkable star that one might notice only on the darkest of nights. The Hartley sisters had been orphaned when Amelia was but 15, their mother succumbing to a wasting illness that no physician could name or cure. It was during those terrible months of watching her mother fade, of witnessing the helplessness of learned doctors with their bleeding and purging, that Amelia had discovered her true calling. An elderly woman from the village, dismissed by the family as a superstitious crone, had brought tisanes of willow bark and feverfew that eased her mother's pain when nothing else would. Though Mrs. Hartley had not survived, Amelia had learned something invaluable, that nature held remedies the medical profession had forgotten or never knew. In the 8 years since, whilst Lucinda perfected the art of captivating drawing rooms and Sophia mastered the pianoforte, Amelia had devoted herself to the study of medicinal herbs. She maintained an elaborate garden at the back of their modest property in Hampshire, cultivating not roses and tulips, but rather comfrey and chamomile, lavender and lemon balm. Her small still room was filled with carefully labeled bottles and dried bundles hanging from the rafters, and the local villagers had learned to seek her out for remedies that actually worked, unlike the expensive and often harmful concoctions prescribed by the traveling physicians. Their guardian uncle, Mr. Theodore Hartley, viewed Amelia's pursuits with benevolent bewilderment. A prosperous merchant who had inherited the care of his brother's daughters, he was generous with pin money and patient with eccentricities, but he understood little of Amelia's work beyond that it kept her contentedly occupied. His primary concern was seeing all 3 girls respectably established, and in this regard, Lucinda's extraordinary beauty was his greatest asset. The invitation to the Lancaster house party had arrived in September, and it was understood by all parties that it represented Lucinda's best opportunity yet. Lady Lancaster, a distant connection on their late mother's side, was renowned for her magnificent autumn gatherings at Willowmere Park in Gloucestershire. The guest list invariably included the most eligible gentlemen of the ton, and this year promised to be particularly splendid, with several titled bachelors confirmed to attend. Amelia had little expectation of the fortnight beyond the opportunity to explore Willowmere's famous gardens and perhaps discover new varieties of herbs in the countryside. She packed her plainest gowns, her notebook of herbal observations, and a small basket of remedies, for one never knew when someone might have need of a headache powder or a sleeping draught. The journey from Hampshire took 2 full days, and by the time their carriage rattled up the long drive to Willowmere Park, Lucinda was in a state of perfect presentation, whilst Amelia was trying to remove grass stains from her hem, having stopped to identify what she suspected was wild valerian growing by the roadside. Willowmere Park was everything the guidebooks promised, a magnificent Palladian mansion set amidst 300 acres of parkland, with formal gardens that would have made Capability Brown weep with envy. The house party consisted of some 30 guests, and Lady Lancaster, a woman of considerable social acumen, had arranged the company to maximize romantic possibilities whilst maintaining absolute propriety. Among the gentlemen present was Edward Chambers, Viscount Denmore, a man whose attendance had caused considerable flutter amongst the matchmaking mammas. At 30 years of age, he possessed not only a viscountcy and a considerable fortune, but also the tragic romance of widowhood. his wife having died 18 months prior whilst delivering their stillborn second child. He had a daughter, Lady Charlotte, aged 5, who remained in London under the care of her grandmother whilst her father attempted this tentative return to society. Amelia first glimpsed the Viscount on the evening of their arrival during the informal gathering in the great drawing room. He stood near the marble fireplace, a glass of claret in his hand, listening with polite attention to something Mr. Pemberton Shaw was explaining with great animation. The Viscount was tall, with the sort of lean build that suggested athleticism rather than indolence, and his dark hair was touched with gray at the temples, grief's premature mark. His face held a quality of stillness, as though he were perpetually listening for something just beyond hearing. But it was his eyes that arrested Amelia's attention during that brief moment before her view was obscured by other guests. They were eyes that had looked upon sorrow and found no easy comfort there, eyes that held both exhaustion and a kind of watchful wariness. She recognized that look, for she had seen it in her own mirror during the months after her mother's death. The observation lasted mere seconds before Lucinda swept into the room like a warm breeze made visible, and every head turned to mark her entrance. Dressed in a gown of palest blue that made her golden hair seem to glow in the candlelight, Lucinda possessed that rare quality of making beauty seem effortless. Amelia watched, as she always did, with a mixture of pride and resignation as her sister became the center of attention, the sun around which the social planets orbited. Amelia herself wore a sensible gown of gray-green muslin that neither flattered nor offended, and she took her customary position near the wall, where she could observe without being observed. It was a position she had perfected over the years, this art of social invisibility. Not hiding precisely, but simply being so thoroughly unremarkable that the eyes slid past her in search of something more interesting to rest upon. The first days at Willowmere followed the immutable rhythm of high society, mornings of hunting for the gentlemen and sedate walks for the ladies, afternoons of cards and musical performances, evenings of elaborate dinners and dancing. Amidst this predictable whirl, Lucinda shone brilliantly, capturing the Viscount Denmore's attention at balls and dinners, dancing with him twice, walking with him in the gardens, making him smile that rare, precious smile that set tongues wagging with delicious speculation. Meanwhile, Amelia, true to her nature, sought refuge in Willowmere's extensive grounds, far more interested in the estate's medicinal flora than in its fauna of eligible bachelors. She filled her pockets with specimens, made detailed notes in her journal, and felt perfectly content with the likelihood of spinsterhood. There were worse fates than remaining unmarried. As a spinster aunt, she could continue her botanical work, perhaps even establish herself as a proper healer with independence and the nieces and nephews her sisters would provide. On the fourth evening, during a musical performance in the music room, Amelia sat in the back row with her small notebook, ostensibly to record her thoughts on the amateur opera being performed, but actually to sketch out the layout for a new section of medicinal garden she was planning. She was so absorbed in calculating the optimal placement for different sun exposure requirements that she failed to notice when the performance ended and the company began to disperse for refreshments. "You appear more interested in your notebook than in Mozart, Miss Hartley." Amelia started, her pencil leaving an unfortunate line across her careful sketch. She looked up to find the Viscount Denmore standing beside her chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine smile she had seen him wear. "I confess the opera left me uninspired, my lord," she said honestly, before remembering that honesty was often considered a social failing amongst the ton. That is, the performers were most earnest in their efforts. "The performers were atrocious," he said, with surprising frankness. "Though I admire your diplomatic phrasing. May I inquire what has captured your attention so thoroughly?" Amelia hesitated, clutching her notebook against her chest. Gentlemen of the ton rarely expressed interest in botanical matters, and she had learned through painful experience that discussing her work often elicited either bored politeness or outright dismissal. "I am planning a medicinal garden, my lord. Nothing that would interest—" "On the contrary," he interrupted, his gray eyes suddenly intent. "I am very much interested. You see, Miss Hartley, my daughter has been unwell these past 6 months, and the physicians seem capable only of prescribing ever more drastic treatments that leave her weaker rather than stronger. There are rumors in London of a certain Dr. Morrison, physician to the Crown, who dares question these barbaric methods. But securing an audience with him is nearly impossible. They say he attends only the highest nobility and by direct recommendation. I confess I have begun to wonder if there might be alternative approaches." Before Amelia could respond, Lady Lancaster appeared with a rustle of silk, graciously insisting that the Viscount must not monopolize one young lady when so many others were eager for his conversation. The moment dissolved, and Lord Denmore was borne away on a tide of social obligation, but not before he cast one last curious glance over his shoulder at the notebook still pressed against Amelia's chest. She returned to her sketch, but her hand trembled slightly as she drew, and the moonwort she was attempting to render came out looking rather like a malformed mushroom. The brief exchange had unsettled her in a way she could not quite name, or perhaps did not wish to name. For what purpose could it serve to acknowledge the small flutter of hope that had lodged itself beneath her ribs? The following morning brought rain, confining the party indoors and creating a restless atmosphere amongst the guests. Amelia retreated to the library, a magnificent room lined with thousands of volumes, where she hoped to find some botanical treatises. Instead, she discovered the Viscount already there, standing before a shelf of medical texts with an expression of profound frustration. "They are all the same," he said, without preamble, not seeming at all surprised to see her. "Every volume preaches bleeding and purging, mercury and laudanum, as though the human body were an enemy to be subdued rather than a system to be supported." Amelia moved closer, examining the titles he had pulled from the shelves. Her fingers traced the spine of one particularly notorious tome. "Dr. Radcliffe's theories killed my mother," she said quietly. "Or rather, the blind application of them did. She needed gentle support, willow bark for pain, feverfew for inflammation, perhaps digitalis in careful measure for her heart. Instead, they bled her until she could barely lift her head from the pillow." The Viscount turned to her, and in his eyes she saw a recognition that went soul deep. "They are bleeding, Charlotte," he said, his voice rough. "They say it will draw out the bad humors that cause her fever. But she is 5 years old, Miss Hartley. She has no humors to spare." "Then you must stop them," Amelia said with quiet ferocity. "You are her father. You are a Viscount. They cannot proceed without your permission." "I have stopped them," he admitted. 3 weeks ago, after the last treatment left her unconscious for 6 hours. My mother was apoplectic. Society whispers that grief has made me irrational, that I am risking my daughter's life by refusing proper medical care. Perhaps they are right. Or perhaps, Amelia said carefully, there are other forms of care that would serve her better. They looked at each other for a long moment, two people who had witnessed the failures of conventional medicine and dared to question its supremacy. Then the library door opened and several other guests entered, chattering about the weather, and the moment of connection fractured into conventional social distance. But something had begun. Some thread had been spun between them, gossamer thin but present, waiting to be strengthened or broken by what came next. The rain continued through the day and into the evening, creating a strange atmospheric pressure that seemed to make everyone irritable and restless. The dinner conversation was unusually sharp, with several near arguments about politics and hunting that were smoothed over only by Lady Lancaster's considerable diplomatic skill. The Viscount barely touched his food, and Amelia noticed him glancing frequently toward the door as though expecting some unwelcome interruption. She understood later that he had been listening for the thing he most dreaded, the sound of a rider arriving with urgent news from London. The guests had retired to their chambers by 11 o'clock, the inclement weather having dampened everyone's enthusiasm for cards or dancing. Amelia was preparing for bed, brushing out her hair in the small mirror of her modest guest room, when she heard the commotion in the hallway. Raised voices, running footsteps, the kind of alarm that turns a peaceful household into barely controlled chaos. She opened her door to find servants hurrying past, with basins of water and armfuls of linens. A young footman, looking close to panic, was explaining to another guest that the Viscount's daughter had arrived unexpectedly an hour ago, brought by his mother, who was convinced the country air might help her condition. But instead of improving, the child had taken a terrible turn. The fever that had plagued her for months had spiked dangerously, and now she lay in convulsions whilst two physicians who happened to be among the house party guests argued over whether to bleed her or administer mercury. Amelia did not pause to think. She ran back to her room, grabbed her basket of remedies, and made her way through the confusion to the room where a circle of concerned guests had gathered outside the door, speaking in hushed, horrified whispers about poor Lord Denmore and his cursed luck, losing both wife and daughter to illness. She pushed through them without apology, opened the door, and slipped inside before anyone could stop her. The scene within would haunt her memory for years to come. The small girl, Lady Charlotte, lay on the bed, her body rigid with fever, her skin blazing and dry to the touch. The two physicians stood on either side, one preparing to open a vein, whilst the other mixed a mercury compound. The child's grandmother, Dowager Viscountess Denmore, sat in a chair looking grey with fear and exhaustion from the journey. And Lord Denmore stood at the foot of the bed, his hands gripping the bedpost so tightly his knuckles had gone white, his face a mask of barely controlled anguish. "Stop," Amelia said, her voice cutting through the room with unexpected authority. The physicians turned to her with affronted surprise. "Young woman, this is no place for—" "I said stop!" She moved to the bedside, placed her hand against Charlotte's forehead, then checked the pulse at her throat. The child's heartbeat was racing far too fast, and her skin was dangerously overheated. "If you bleed her now, you will kill her. If you give her mercury in this state, you will kill her. Move aside." "Lord Denmore," one physician sputtered, "surely you will not allow this girl to interfere with proper medical treatment." "Get out!" The Viscount's voice was absolutely level, absolutely cold. "Both of you, now!" The physicians departed with affronted dignity, muttering about lawsuits and professional responsibility. The dowager started to protest, but something in her son's face made her hold her tongue. She remained in her chair, watching with exhausted wariness as this unremarkable girl began to work. Amelia moved with swift efficiency, her years of practical experience taking over. From her basket, she withdrew a bottle of willow bark tincture, another of feverfew, and a third of passion flower extract. She mixed them in precise proportions with water from the basin, tested the temperature on her own wrist, then gently lifted Charlotte's head and coaxed the liquid between the child's lips, a few drops at a time. "What are you giving her?" The dowager's voice was sharp with fear. "Willow bark to reduce the fever, feverfew to calm the inflammation, passion flower to ease the convulsions," Amelia explained, her voice steady despite her own anxiety. "They are gentle remedies, my lady. They will not cure her, but they will support her body's own attempt to heal itself." She sent a servant for cool water, not ice-cold, which could send the body into shock, but tepid, and cloths. For the next hour, she worked steadily, sponging Charlotte's burning skin, administering small doses of the tincture at regular intervals, speaking quietly to the child even though she seemed unconscious, telling her stories about gardens and flowers and the way spring always follows winter. Lord Denmore never left the bedside. He watched Amelia's every movement with an intensity that would have made her self-conscious under other circumstances, but she was too focused on her small patient to pay it much mind. Occasionally, she gave him tasks. Hold the child thus, support her head so, press this cool cloth to her pulse points, and he obeyed without question, his large hands surprisingly gentle. Somewhere past 2 a.m, Charlotte's fever broke. The change was not dramatic, no miracle moment of eyes flying open and recovery complete. Instead, her racing heart began to slow, Her rigid muscles began to relax, and the terrible heat began to subside into something closer to normal warmth. She slipped from the strange unconsciousness of severe fever into actual sleep, her breathing evening out, one small hand curling loosely in the sheets. Amelia sat back, suddenly aware that her own dress was soaked with perspiration and water. Her hair had come completely loose from its braid, and she was trembling with exhaustion and relief. The dowager had fallen asleep in her chair. Lord Denmore remained kneeling beside the bed, one hand resting near his daughter's head, his eyes closed. "You should rest, my lord," Amelia said softly. "She will need careful watching for the next few days, but the crisis has passed." He opened his eyes and looked at her, and what she saw there made her breath catch. It was not mere gratitude, though that was present. It was something deeper, rawer, a kind of profound recognition, as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time, seeing not just what she had done, but what she was. "You saved her life," he said, his voice hoarse. "I gave her body the support it needed to save itself," Amelia corrected. "The fever would have burned itself out eventually, though perhaps not before causing permanent damage. I simply helped." "No." He reached out and caught her hand, holding it in both of his. His hands were warm, slightly calloused from riding, and they trembled faintly. "You did far more than help. You did what I could not, what the learned physicians could not. You saw what she needed, and you provided it, without hesitation, without doubt. You saved my daughter, Miss Hartley. You saved the only family I have left." Amelia withdrew her hand gently, uncomfortable with the intensity of his emotion, with the way it made something in her own chest tighten and ache. "I am glad I could be of service, my lord. I should go now. It would not be proper for me to remain here now that the emergency has passed." She gathered her basket and moved toward the door, but his voice stopped her. "Will you come tomorrow? To check on her? Please." She turned back and saw that the formidable Viscount, the man who commanded respect in the House of Lords and managed one of the largest estates in England, was asking her, begging her, with his whole heart visible in his eyes. "Of course," she said quietly. "I will come in the morning." As she slipped back to her own room through the now quiet corridors, Amelia tried to quiet the dangerous feelings rising in her chest. She had done what any skilled healer would do, she told herself. There was nothing more to it than that. The Viscount was grateful, as any father would be. His hand holding hers had been merely an expression of that gratitude. But her heart knew better. Her heart recognized something that her practical mind refused to acknowledge, that in that overheated sick room, with a child's life hanging in the balance, something profound had shifted between them. Some barrier had fallen, some truth had been revealed, and there would be no returning to the careful distance of polite society. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she sat by her window and watched the rain finally cease, watched the clouds begin to break apart to reveal stars, and tried not to think about the way his hands had trembled when he held hers, or the way his eyes had looked at her as though she were something miraculous. Tried and failed entirely. The news of Lady Charlotte's miraculous recovery spread through Willowmere Park before breakfast was served. The story had been inevitably embroidered in the telling. Some guests claimed the child had been at death's door, others that both physicians had pronounced her beyond help, and nearly everyone expressed amazement that Miss Hartley, the middle sister, the quiet one, the one nobody really noticed, had somehow effected this remarkable cure. Amelia found herself the subject of unprecedented attention at breakfast, though it was the uncomfortable sort that came with curiosity rather than genuine interest. The other young ladies looked at her with newfound assessment, as though trying to determine what this accomplishment might mean for the social hierarchy they had carefully established. The gentlemen spoke to her with confused politeness, uncertain whether healing arts were an accomplishment to be admired or a peculiarity to be overlooked. Only Lucinda seemed genuinely delighted, embracing her sister and declaring proudly to anyone who would listen that Amelia had always possessed remarkable gifts with medicinal herbs. But even Lucinda's enthusiasm carried a certain patronizing quality, as though Amelia's achievement were charming, but ultimately not quite in the same sphere as beauty or musical talent. Lord Denmore did not appear at breakfast. According to Lady Lancaster, he was remaining with his daughter, who, though much improved, still required rest and observation. Amelia felt a curious mix of relief and disappointment at his absence. Relief because she did not know how to face him in the bright light of day and polite society. Disappointment for reasons she refused to examine too closely. She kept her promise and visited Charlotte's sick room mid-morning. The Dowager Viscountess admitted her with stiff courtesy, though her eyes held a complex mixture of gratitude and something that looked almost like resentment. Charlotte was awake, propped up on pillows, still pale, but miraculously free of fever. She was a delicate child with her father's gray eyes and fine dark hair, and she watched Amelia's approach with solemn curiosity. "Are you the herb lady?" Charlotte asked, in a voice that was thread-thin from exhaustion. "I suppose I am," Amelia said, smiling as she checked the child's pulse and temperature. "How are you feeling this morning, Lady Charlotte?" "Tired, but not hot anymore." The hot was horrible. It made everything look wrong and sound strange. Amelia prepared another dose of the willow bark mixture, this one milder since the acute crisis had passed. As she worked, she was acutely conscious of Lord Denmore standing near the window, watching her with that same intense attention he had shown the previous night. In daylight, she could see the exhaustion written in the shadows beneath his eyes, the haggard quality of a man who had not slept. "She should continue with small doses of this 3 times daily for the next week," Amelia explained to the Dowager, carefully not looking at the Viscount. "Light foods only, broths, toast, perhaps a little chicken. No rich meats or heavy sauces. She needs rest above all, but short walks in fresh air will help rebuild her strength." "We are in your debt, Miss Hartley," the Dowager said formally, though her tone suggested she found this fact uncomfortable. "There is no debt, my lady. I am simply glad I could help." She left before the Viscount could speak, though she felt his gaze following her from the room. The house party continued, though its character had shifted subtly. The rain had cleared, revealing a brilliant autumn day, perfect for outdoor pursuits. The gentlemen organized a riding party to view the ruins of an old abbey some miles distant, whilst the ladies planned an excursion to the village to visit the lending library and milliner's shop. Amelia begged off both activities, claiming a headache. In truth, she wanted nothing more than to walk alone in the gardens and try to sort through the confused tangle of her thoughts. She had saved a child's life. She should have felt satisfaction, pride even. Instead, she felt unsettled, as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted and she could not find her balance. She was examining a bed of late-blooming autumn crocuses, making notes about their medicinal properties, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She knew without turning who it was. Some instinct warned her even before his shadow fell across her notebook. "Miss Hartley, I hoped I might find you here." She turned to face Lord Denmore, who had apparently declined to join the gentleman's excursion. He looked better than he had that morning. He had slept a few hours at his mother's insistence and changed his clothes, but there was still a tautness about him, a quality of barely restrained emotion. "How is Lady Charlotte?" she asked, because it was the safe question, the proper question. Asking for stories and demanding to know when she can see the gardens, which is to say, very much improved thanks to your intervention. He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "I wanted to speak with you properly, without my mother present or servants hovering. I wanted to thank you. Please, my lord, there is no need. There is every need," he said with sudden intensity. "You cannot comprehend what you have given back to me. Charlotte she is everything. After my wife died, after we lost the baby, I thought I would drown in grief. Charlotte was the only light left in my world, the only reason to continue. When she fell ill and no one could help her, when I watched her growing weaker whilst learned physicians prescribed treatments that seemed designed to torment rather than heal." He stopped, visibly collecting himself. "You gave me hope, Miss Hartley. You showed me that there are other ways of seeing, other approaches to healing. You treated my daughter as a whole person rather than a collection of symptoms to be suppressed." Amelia found herself unable to look away from his face, from the raw honesty in his expression. "I did only what I have learned to do, my lord, what I have studied for years. It is no great miracle." "It is to me," he said simply. They stood in the autumn garden, surrounded by the gentle rustling of falling leaves, and something passed between them, some current of understanding and connection that went beyond words. Amelia felt it in her bones, in her heart, in the suddenly unsteady rhythm of her breathing. For a moment, just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that this remarkable man might see her as something other than a useful healer, that the way he looked at her might mean, "There you are, Lord Denmore. We have been searching everywhere for you." The moment shattered as Lucinda appeared on the path, radiant in a walking dress of jonquil yellow, accompanied by two of the other young ladies and a harried-looking chaperone. She smiled brilliantly at the Viscount, then seemed to notice Amelia for the first time. "Oh, and Amelia too! How fortunate! We are organizing an impromptu archery contest. You must both join us." "Lord Denmore, I simply insist. You cannot spend the entire party in sick rooms and gardens. Your daughter is on the mend, and you deserve some amusement." The Viscount cast one last look at Amelia, something regretful in his eyes, then allowed himself to be drawn away by Lucinda's irresistible enthusiasm. Amelia watched them go, watched her sister loop her hand through his arm with easy confidence, watched the way the other ladies arranged themselves around him like petals around a flower's center. She returned to her crocuses, but the notes she made were illegible, her hand shaking too much to write clearly. Over the following days, a pattern established itself. Lord Denmore spent his mornings with Charlotte, who was recovering rapidly under Amelia's continued care. But his afternoons and evenings were increasingly claimed by Lucinda, who had apparently decided that the Viscount was the prize of the house party and meant to secure him. She walked with him in the gardens, rode with him when Charlotte's health allowed him to join the riding parties, sat beside him at dinner, and charmed him with witty conversation and luminous smiles. And to Amelia's growing dismay, the Viscount seemed receptive to these attentions. He smiled at Lucinda's jokes, partnered her for dances, engaged in animated conversation about literature and music. Yet the astute observer, had anyone been watching closely, would have noted how his eyes would drift during these encounters, scanning drawing rooms and gardens as though searching for something just beyond his immediate companion. During one particularly animated discussion about Mozart, whilst Lucinda described a concert in London, the Viscount's gaze wandered across the music room, pausing briefly on Amelia's quiet figure near the bookshelf before returning to his interlocutor with studied politeness. But such moments were fleeting, easily missed by those who expected a courtship to follow conventional patterns. The rest of the house party watched with knowing looks, and the whispers began. Surely an announcement must be imminent, for why else would a man of Lord Denmore's consequence pay such marked attention to one particular young lady? What no one seemed to notice, or what they noticed but misinterpreted, was that Lord Denmore also sought out Amelia's company. He appeared in the still-room where she was preparing Charlotte's remedies, ostensibly to inquire about his daughter's treatment, but staying to ask questions about herbal medicine, about the properties of different plants, about the philosophy behind treating the whole person rather than isolated symptoms. He found her in the library, researching an obscure botanical treatise, and ended up spending 2 hours discussing the failures of contemporary medicine and the potential of natural remedies. He walked with her in the gardens before breakfast, when the rest of the household was still abed, and they talked about loss, about his wife and her mother, about grief and guilt, and the struggle to continue living when the person who made life meaningful was gone. He spoke of things he had never voiced to anyone, and she responded with an honesty that surprised herself, acknowledging fears and doubts she had never confessed aloud. But these meetings were private, almost secret. In company, He behaved with perfect propriety toward Amelia, whilst paying increasingly marked attention to Lucinda. The divide between his public and private behaviors became starkly apparent one afternoon when Amelia, passing through the corridor outside the drawing room, overheard Lady Lancaster speaking with the Dowager Lady Pembridge in tones of satisfied conspiracy. Lord Denmore and Miss Lucinda Hartley make such a splendid pair. Her beauty is the perfect antidote to his melancholy. I should not be surprised if an announcement is made before Christmas. He has been most particular in his attentions. The words struck Amelia like a physical blow, cementing what society saw as fact. And Amelia, with her years of practice at being overlooked, began to construct a narrative that made painful sense of his behavior. He valued her skill as a healer and her knowledge of medicine. He enjoyed their intellectual conversations as a scholar might enjoy discussing specialized subjects with an expert. But his heart, his romantic interest, lay with Lucinda, which was only natural. Beautiful, accomplished, charming Lucinda, who would make a perfect Viscountess and mother to Charlotte. The thought of it created a hollow ache in Amelia's chest that she tried desperately to ignore. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that she had known from the beginning there could be nothing between herself and the Viscount. She was not the sort of woman men married. She was too plain, too peculiar, too focused on unfeminine pursuits. The brief connection she had felt with Lord Denmore was merely the intensity of shared crisis and mutual interest in healing. It meant nothing more. She almost convinced herself of this until the evening of the final ball. Lady Lancaster had organized a grand affair to conclude the house party, and the ballroom at Willowmere had been transformed into a fairy realm with thousands of candles and autumn flowers. Amelia wore her best gown, a simple creation in dark green that did nothing remarkable for her complexion, but at least fit properly, and took her usual position near the wall, prepared to watch Lucinda dance the night away in triumph. Lord Denmore opened the ball with Lucinda, as protocol demanded for the gentleman paying court to a particular lady. They made a striking couple, Amelia had to admit. His dark elegance and her golden beauty perfectly complemented. As she watched them move through the figures of the dance, watched Lucinda laugh at something he said, watched the way other guests smiled knowingly at the pair, Amelia felt the fan in her hand begin to tremble. She closed it with a sharp snap, the sound lost in the music, and knew she needed air before the facade of calm she wore, like a second skin, shattered completely. She slipped out of the ballroom, through the French doors onto the terrace, needing darkness and solitude. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead, and she wrapped her arms around herself against the chill, trying to compose her features before anyone noticed her absence. "Miss Hartley?" She turned to find the Viscount standing in the doorway, backlit by the golden glow of the ballroom. He stepped onto the terrace, closing the door behind him, muting the music to a distant waltz. "Are you unwell? I saw you leave." "I am perfectly well, my lord," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. "Simply needed a moment of quiet. You should return to the ball. I believe Miss Lancaster wished to partner you for the next set, and my sister—" "Confound the next set," he said with sudden vehemence. "Confound all these ridiculous social games. Miss Hartley, Amelia, these past days talking with you, learning from you, I have begun to hope." He took a step closer, and Amelia's heart began to race with something that felt dangerously like hope. In the starlight, his face was all plains and shadows, his eyes dark and intent. "I know this is hardly the time or place, but I find I cannot wait any longer. These weeks at Willowmere have shown me something I did not expect to find." "Happiness," Amelia interrupted, her voice strangled. "Of course you have found happiness, my lord. My sister is everything wonderful. She will make you an excellent wife and a kind mother to Charlotte. I know you must be eager to secure the arrangement before we all depart tomorrow. I hope you will allow me to be among the first to congratulate you both." Lord Denmore stared at her as though she had begun speaking in Sanskrit. "Your sister? Miss Hartley, I believe there has been a profound misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding, my lord," Amelia said, feeling tears threaten and absolutely refusing to allow them to fall. I have eyes. I have watched you court Lucinda these past 10 days. Every walk in the gardens, every dance, every charming conversation. The entire household speaks of nothing else. I think it is wonderful. Truly, I do. Lucinda deserves every happiness, and you deserve a fresh start with someone who can bring light back into your life. You think I have been courting your sister, he said slowly, as though testing each word. You believe that my attentions have been directed toward Miss Lucinda Hartley. Everyone believes it, my lord. And why should they not? She is beautiful, accomplished, everything a viscount could want in a wife. I hope you will both be very happy. The words tasted like ashes in her mouth, but she forced them out. When you make your formal offer tomorrow, I shall be honored to stand as witness to her joy. And I shall be equally honored to continue serving as Charlotte's healer, if you wish it. I would never let our friendship interfere with her care. She could not read his expression in the darkness, could not interpret the quality of his silence. After a moment, he bowed stiffly. I see I have been laboring under a considerable misapprehension. I apologize for disturbing your evening, Miss Hartley. I shall leave you to your contemplations. He returned to the ballroom, and Amelia sank down onto the cold stone bench, pressing her hands against her face. She had done the right thing, the practical thing. She had saved them both from an embarrassing scene. She had preserved her dignity and his, had prevented him from saying something in the heat of emotion that he might regret in the morning's clearer light. So why did doing the right thing feel so devastatingly, irretrievably wrong? The house party concluded the following afternoon with effusive farewells and promises to meet again in London for the season. Lord Denmore departed early, taking his mother and daughter back to town before most of the other guests had finished breakfast. He left a brief, formal note thanking Lady Lancaster for her hospitality and expressing his gratitude to Miss Amelia Hartley for her excellent care of his daughter, along with a generous sum to cover the cost of the remedies she had provided. The note was everything proper and nothing personal. Amelia folded it carefully and placed it in her journal, where it lay like a pressed flower, beautiful and dead. The journey back to Hampshire was tense. Lucinda, rather than confused, seemed genuinely irritated. As their carriage rolled through the autumn countryside, she turned to Amelia with uncharacteristic sharpness. He barely looked at me this morning, Amelia, after spending days at my side, walking and dancing and conversing. What was it you said to him on that terrace to make him flee like a startled horse? The accusation hung in the air between them, born of wounded pride and genuine bewilderment. Amelia, dying inside with her own pain, made appropriate apologetic noises, claiming she had merely wished him well in his future courtship. Lucinda subsided into silence, staring out the window with a frown that gradually softened into something more thoughtful, though she said nothing more on the subject for the remainder of the journey. The weeks that followed were uniquely torturous. Autumn deepened into early winter, and Amelia threw herself into her work with desperate intensity. She expanded her stillroom, experimented with new tinctures, worked in the garden until her hands were numb with cold. Anything to avoid thinking about gray eyes and trembling hands and conversations in misty gardens. But escape proved impossible. Letters arrived from London with disturbing regularity, bearing news of Lord Denmore's activities in society. He had taken a house for the season. He was seen at various social functions. His mother, the Dowager Viscountess, had been heard expressing satisfaction that her son was finally emerging from mourning and considering matrimony again. But he did not call upon the Hartley household. He did not write to Lucinda or request permission to court her. He seemed to have vanished from their lives as completely as though the weeks at Willowmere had never happened. Amelia told herself she was glad. She had done what was necessary, had recognized reality, and acted accordingly. If there was a hollow place in her chest where hope had briefly bloomed, well, she had decades of practice at ignoring such things. Christmas came and went in quiet celebration. Uncle Theodore gave them each a generous gift of pin money and expressed satisfaction at how well the house party had gone, even if it had not yet resulted in any formal offers. "There was always the spring season," he said cheerfully. Plenty of time for Lucinda to secure a good match. Lucinda herself seemed less certain. She had received several offers from gentlemen of respectable fortune, but she had gently declined them all, claiming she did not feel quite ready. When pressed, she admitted to Amelia in a private moment that she kept thinking of Lord Denmore, of how he had looked at Amelia in the sick room that night, of how he had sought her sister's company despite Lucinda's best efforts to capture his attention. "I think," Lucinda said slowly, with more perception than she usually showed, "that I may have been pursuing a gentleman whose heart was already engaged elsewhere. I think we both were pursuing him, in our different ways, and neither of us understood what the other was doing." Amelia denied it, of course, vehemently and at length, until Lucinda dropped the subject with a skeptical look that suggested she was not fooled but was too kind to press the point. January arrived with frost and fog, and with it came devastating news. Sophia's daughter, little Catherine, had fallen ill with the same kind of fever that had nearly claimed Lady Charlotte. Sophia and her husband lived in a small manor in Kent, some 50 miles distant, and the letter that arrived begged Amelia to come at once. The local physician had bled the child twice, and she was growing weaker rather than stronger. Sophia was beside herself with terror, remembering too well how their mother had died despite, or perhaps because of, similar treatments. Amelia left within the hour, taking her entire store of remedies and pausing only to send word to Uncle Theodore of where she had gone. The journey seemed interminable, her anxiety growing with every mile. She arrived at Sophia's home to find her sister red-eyed with weeping, her husband gray with worry, and little Catherine burning with fever in a bed too large for her small form. The physician was preparing another bleeding when Amelia arrived. She stopped him with the same cold authority she had used at Willowmere, and this time she had Sophia's desperate support. The physician departed in high dudgeon, pronouncing the entire family mad and washing his hands of whatever tragic outcome might follow. Amelia set to work, fighting exhaustion and terror in equal measure. As she prepared the tincture, her hands trembled, not merely from fatigue, but from an old, familiar fear. She saw in Catherine's fevered features the ghost of her mother's face, felt the same helplessness of inadequate medicine hanging in the air like a curse. This time, she could not fail. This time, her knowledge had to be enough. She drew on every scrap of knowledge and experience she possessed, singing soft songs to the delirious child, whilst internally cataloging symptoms, adjusting dosages, searching desperately for what she might be missing. Night fell, the fever held. Catherine's breathing grew labored, and Amelia felt panic rising in her throat. She was missing something, overlooking some crucial element. The child needed more than herbs and cool water. She needed something Amelia did not have, some medical knowledge beyond her reach. She was measuring out another dose of feverfew with shaking hands when she heard a commotion downstairs. Voices, footsteps, someone demanding to be brought to the sick room at once. Before she could make sense of it, the door opened and Lord Denmore strode in, followed by his mother, and behind them, a distinguished-looking gentleman carrying a physician's bag. Amelia stared at them in shock and confusion, her exhausted mind unable to process their presence. The Viscount looked at her, at the child, at the desperate tableau before him, and his expression softened with understanding and something fiercer, determination. "Dr. Morrison," he said to the gentleman behind him, "this is Miss Amelia Hartley, the healer I told you about. Miss Hartley, this is Dr. Edmund Morrison, personal physician to the royal family and the most progressive medical mind in England. I took the liberty of bringing him." The doctor moved to the bedside with the confident ease of a man who had treated thousands of patients. He examined Catherine thoroughly, whilst Amelia explained what treatments she had given and what results she had observed. To her surprise, he nodded approvingly at each remedy she mentioned. "Excellent choices, Miss Hartley. Your instincts are sound. But I think we need to add something to support the heart and lungs, which are being strained by the prolonged fever. Do you have digitalis in your supplies? I do, but I was uncertain of the proper dosage for a child so young. Then we shall work it out together, he said with a kind smile. Show me what you have, and we shall compound something appropriate. For the next 3 hours, they worked in concert. Amelia's knowledge of herbs combined with Dr. Morrison's understanding of physiology and pharmacology. The Dowager Viscountess took charge of organizing the household, ensuring a steady supply of clean linens and water. Lord Denmore supported Sophia and her husband, speaking quietly to them of hope and recovery, his own experience with Charlotte's illness making his reassurance meaningful rather than empty. And slowly, incrementally, Catherine began to improve. The fever broke near dawn, leaving the child weak but peaceful, sleeping naturally for the first time in days. Amelia, gray with exhaustion, sat back and closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks, tears of relief and release and complete emotional overload. She felt a hand on her shoulder and opened her eyes to find Lord Denmore kneeling beside her chair. His face was close to hers, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, the fine lines that grief and worry had carved around his mouth. "How did you know?" she whispered. "How did you know to come?" "Lucinda sent word to my London house," he said quietly. "She said her nephew was gravely ill and that you had gone to treat him, and she thought I should know. She said several other things as well, things that suggested she understood more about the situation than we had given her credit for." "I do not understand," Amelia said, too tired to maintain any pretense. "I think you do," he replied gently. "Or you would, if you were not so convinced of your own invisibility. But perhaps this is not the time for such conversations. You need rest, and there are others who need reassurance. We can speak later when you have slept." But Amelia caught his hand as he started to rise, her exhaustion making her bold. "You brought a royal physician to treat my nephew. You traveled 50 miles in January because my sister sent word that I needed help. Why?" He looked at her for a long moment, his thumb unconsciously stroking across the back of her hand. "Because I could not bear the thought of you facing this alone," he said simply. "Because the idea of you exhausting yourself in a hopeless cause when I had the means to help was intolerable to me. Because—" He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "Because when someone you care for needs assistance, you do not hesitate or count the cost. You simply help. You taught me that, Miss Hartley, at Willowmere, when you saved Charlotte without thinking of propriety or reputation or reward. I am merely returning what you gave me." Amelia could not speak past the lump in her throat, could only look at him with eyes that surely revealed everything she had tried so hard to hide. But before either of them could say more, Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway, announcing that the child should continue to be carefully monitored and that he would stay through the day to ensure no relapse occurred. The moment passed, but something had shifted again, something that felt less like breaking and more like mending, like pieces of a puzzle finally beginning to align. The household settled into an exhausted peace as Catherine's recovery progressed. Dr. Morrison remained for 2 days, working with Amelia to establish a treatment regimen and expressing such enthusiasm for her botanical approach that he asked permission to consult with her about several difficult cases he was treating in London. The Dowager Viscountess also remained, ostensibly to ensure her granddaughter's friend received the same level of care Charlotte had received, though Amelia suspected she was observing her son's behavior with keen maternal interest. Lord Denmore showed no signs of departing. He took rooms at the local inn and appeared at the house each day, always with some reasonable excuse, to check on Catherine's progress, to deliver a book, Doctor. Morrison had mentioned to discuss a letter he had received from Charlotte describing her delight at being allowed to help in the kitchen garden he was having installed at his estate. But his real purpose became clear in the quiet moments he engineered to be alone with Amelia. As she worked in Sophia's still room, preparing remedies under Dr. Morrison's interested supervision, Lord Denmore would appear in the doorway with tea or with a question about herbs. When she took brief walks in the winter garden to clear her head, he somehow materialized at her side, speaking of inconsequential things, until the conversation deepened into the kind of honest discourse they had shared at Willowmere. 3 days after Catherine's fever broke, as Amelia was gathering her supplies to prepare for the return journey to Hampshire, Lord Denmore requested a private audience with her in Sophia's drawing room. Her sister and brother-in-law made themselves scarce with knowing looks that made Amelia's pulse race with anxiety, and something dangerously close to hope. He stood by the window, his back to her as she entered, his posture unusually tense. When he turned, his face held an expression she had never seen before, determination mixed with vulnerability, resolve shadowed by fear. "Miss Hartley, Amelia, we must speak plainly," he began without preamble. "There has been too much misunderstanding between us, too many assumptions made and words left unspoken. I will not allow the pattern to continue." Amelia's hands twisted in her skirts, her heart hammering. "My lord, if this is about payment for the remedies or Dr. Morrison's services, I assure you—" "It is not about payment," he said, moving closer. "It is about the fact that I have been a coward and a fool, and that my cowardice has caused you unnecessary pain. It is about the fact that at Willowmere, on the terrace, you interrupted me before I could speak the truth. You assumed I wished to court your sister, when in reality—" He paused, seeming to gather courage. "When in reality, it is you I have been courting. It is you I have been trying, badly I now realize, to woo." Amelia stared at him, her mind refusing to process his words. "But you walked with Lucinda. You danced with her, sat beside her at dinner, paid her every attention." "I was being a damned fool," he said bluntly. "Your pardon for the language, but there is no other word for it. I thought, idiotically, that if I appeared to court your sister whilst having private conversations with you, I was somehow protecting your reputation. That society would think any attention I paid you was merely polite interest in my daughter's healer, whilst my true intentions remained properly directed toward the acknowledged beauty of the family. I thought I was being clever, giving us time to know each other without subjecting you to speculation and gossip." He laughed bitterly. "Instead, I convinced you that you were invisible to me, that whatever connection existed between us was merely intellectual appreciation. I am an idiot." "You are not an idiot," Amelia said faintly, her world tilting on its axis. "You are a viscount who could have anyone, who should want someone beautiful and accomplished, and—" "I want someone who sees the world differently than everyone else," he interrupted. "Someone who trusts in nature's wisdom rather than blindly following convention. Someone who saved my daughter's life with herbs and compassion when learned physicians were ready to bleed her to death. Someone who spent 3 days fighting to save her nephew without thought for her own exhaustion. Someone who makes me think and argue and question, who looks at me as though I were simply Edward rather than Lord Denmore." He took her hands in his, and this time she did not pull away. "I want someone who understands loss and has learned to live with it rather than being destroyed by it. Someone who has been overlooked her entire life but never let it diminish her worth or her work. Someone who, quite frankly, terrifies me because my feelings for her are so overwhelming that I have been clumsy and foolish in trying to express them." "I am not beautiful like Lucinda," Amelia whispered, the old fear rising. "You are beautiful to me," he said firmly. "Your beauty is in the concentration on your face when you work, in the gentleness of your hands when you treat the sick, in the fierce intelligence in your eyes when you speak of things you are passionate about. Your beauty is unconventional, yes, but it is real and deep and lasting. It is the kind of beauty that grows richer with knowing rather than fading with familiarity." Tears were spilling down Amelia's cheeks now, years of feeling invisible and unnecessary, cracking apart under the force of his words. But what would society say? A viscount marrying the peculiar middle sister, the one who spends her time with herbs rather than accomplishments? Society may say what it wishes, he replied. I have learned through bitter experience that society's opinions matter far less than the people we love. When my wife died and society prescribed a year of formal mourning, followed by a prudent remarriage to ensure Charlotte had a mother, they did not account for grief or guilt or the weight of continuing to live when someone you loved is gone. You understood those things. You never once told me how I should feel or when I should be over it. You simply saw me. That kind of understanding is worth more than 1,000 perfect curtsies or accomplished piano performances. He released one of her hands to reach into his coat pocket, withdrawing a folded paper. I had intended to wait until you had rested, until circumstances were more appropriate. But waiting has caused us nothing but trouble thus far. This is a contract with the most respected architectural firm in London. I have commissioned them to design and build a complete botanical research facility on my estate in Derbyshire. Greenhouses, a laboratory, a library, everything you would need to continue your work on a proper scale. I want you to have a place where you can study and experiment and develop treatments that could help not just individuals, but potentially change how medicine is practiced in this country. Amelia looked at the papers, at the detailed sketches of elegant glass structures and rooms lined with shelves, and something inside her broke open. You did this for me? I did this for us, he corrected. I am not so foolish as to think I can simply take you away from your work or ask you to abandon your calling for my sake. I want to be part of your work. I want Charlotte to grow up learning that women can be healers and scientists, that there are paths beyond drawing rooms and dance floors. He paused, his voice roughening. I want to build a life with you that honors both of us, that makes room for your gift, while giving me the privilege of supporting it. Edward, she whispered, using his name for the first time. Amelia, he answered. Will you marry me? Will you be Charlotte's mother and my wife and continue your healing work? Will you help me establish a clinic where the poor can receive treatment without payment, where your methods can be taught to others? Will you take a chance on a grieving widower who loves you so much he has bungled everything but cannot imagine a future that does not include you? She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw what she should have seen all along, the way his eyes softened when they rested on her, the careful attention he paid to everything she said, the way he had brought a royal physician not for glory or display, but simply because she needed help and he had the means to provide it. The greenhouse plans he had commissioned without any certainty she would accept him, simply because he wanted her to have what she needed to thrive. Yes, she said, the word escaping on a sob of relief and joy. Yes, I will marry you. I will be Charlotte's mother and your wife, and I will build a clinic and research facility and everything else. Yes. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her as though she were infinitely precious. And Amelia felt years of invisibility and doubt dissolve in the warmth of his embrace. When he finally released her enough to look into her face, he was smiling. A real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and transformed his entire countenance. I should warn you, he said, still smiling. My mother has very definite opinions about wedding arrangements, and Charlotte has been planning your wedding in elaborate detail since the night you saved her life. She has decided you must wear a crown of flowers and that the wedding breakfast should feature strawberry tarts. It is January, Amelia said, laughing through her tears. There are no strawberries. Then we shall have to wait until spring, he replied, which is probably wise in any case, as I would prefer to be certain your family approves and that we observe at least minimal propriety. Though I confess I would marry you tomorrow in the parish church with no one but Charlotte and your sisters present, if you would have me. Spring, Amelia agreed, but not too late in spring. Perhaps April? April, he confirmed, and then he kissed her, gently at first, as though she might break, then more deeply as she responded with all the pent-up emotion of weeks of misunderstanding and longing. When they finally emerged from the drawing room, They found Sophia and her husband, attempting to look as though they had not been hovering in the hallway, and both burst into delighted congratulations. Dr. Morrison, preparing to depart for London, expressed his pleasure at the news and reiterated his invitation for Amelia to consult on difficult cases. Even the Dowager Viscountess, when informed, unbent enough to embrace Amelia and admit that she had suspected her son's true feelings from the beginning, and was pleased he had finally shown some sense in expressing them. Only one person's reaction remained uncertain: Lucinda. The return journey to Hampshire took place 2 days later, with Lord Denmore and his mother traveling as escorts to ensure propriety. The Viscount had formally requested Uncle Theodore's permission to court Amelia, and that gentleman, bewildered but pleased, had given his blessing with the caveat that a proper engagement period be observed. Amelia spent the journey in a state of bemused happiness, unable to quite believe that her life had transformed so completely. But her joy was shadowed by one remaining anxiety: Lucinda's reaction. They arrived at the Hartley house in late afternoon, and Amelia found Lucinda in the drawing room, working on an embroidery project with unusual intensity. She looked up as Amelia entered, and for a moment her expression was unreadable. Then she set aside her needlework and smiled, a smile that seemed to carry equal parts amusement and relief. "So," Lucinda said without preamble, "he finally told you the truth, did he? Thank heavens. I was beginning to think I would have to spell it out for both of you with alphabet blocks." Amelia blinked. "You knew?" "My dear Amelia," Lucinda said with affectionate exasperation, "I may favor drawing rooms over herb gardens, but I am not entirely empty-headed. Of course I knew. The man could not stop looking at you at Willowmere. Every conversation we had inevitably circled back to your remarkable skills or interesting perspectives. I saw how he looked at you in Charlotte's sick room that night, and I realized I was being courted by a man whose heart was already engaged elsewhere." She pulled back to look at Amelia seriously. "And to be entirely honest, Amelia, I felt a certain relief. The idea of being Viscountess to a man so intense was rather daunting. He and his daughter deserve someone who can speak their language of healing and loss and all those weighty subjects. I shine in ballrooms, not in debates about life and death. You and he speak the same language. I would have been merely an inadequate translator between two souls meant to converse directly." "But you are so much more suited to be a Viscountess," Amelia protested weakly. "Suited for the social requirements, perhaps," Lucinda agreed, "but utterly unsuited for the man himself. He is yours, Amelia, and truly he always was." The sisters embraced, and Amelia felt another piece of her old self-doubt crumble away. She had spent so many years believing she was the lesser sister, never considering that Lucinda might have her own insecurities, her own ways of understanding the world. The weeks that followed brought a whirlwind of preparation. The engagement was announced, causing considerable surprise in society, but also genuine interest. The story of the unconventional healer who had captured a Viscount's heart possessed an undeniable romantic appeal. Lord Denmore divided his time between London and Hampshire, courting Amelia with determined focus, bringing Charlotte to meet her future mother, consulting with Dr. Morrison on the clinic they would establish together. The wedding took place on a perfect April morning, with spring flowers blooming in wild profusion. Despite Lord Denmore's prominence, they chose a relatively modest affair: close family, dear friends, and the villagers Amelia had treated over the years. Lucinda had designed the wedding gown, a masterpiece of cream silk embroidered with botanical motifs. Rather than a traditional veil, Amelia wore a crown of fresh flowers that Charlotte had helped arrange: rosemary for remembrance, lavender for devotion, and roses for love. Edward's eyes, when he first saw her walking down the aisle, suggested he found her quite satisfactorily beautiful, invisible no longer. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Miss Amelia Hartley, the forgotten sister who spent her youth in the shadows of beauty and convention, became Lady Denmore, not merely a Viscountess by title, but a healer, a scientist, and a pioneer in her own right. The Botanical Research Facility at Thornfield Hall became renowned throughout England, and the clinic she established with her husband treated thousands of the poor who had previously been subjected to the barbaric practices of conventional medicine. Together with Dr. Morrison, she published groundbreaking papers on natural remedies that challenged the medical establishment and saved countless lives. Her marriage to Lord Denmore proved to be that rarest of things, a true partnership of minds and hearts. They raised Charlotte together, teaching her that a woman could be both a lady and a scholar, both gentle and strong. In time, the girl followed in her mother's footsteps, becoming one of the first female physicians to be recognized, however grudgingly, by the Royal Medical Society. Lucinda made her own excellent match to a baronet who appreciated her beauty and charm without requiring intellectual discourse, and proved to be a devoted aunt who delighted in spoiling her nieces and nephews. Sophia's children all grew strong and healthy under Amelia's watchful care, and no member of the Hartley family ever again suffered the inadequate medical treatment that had claimed their mother. But perhaps the greatest triumph was this: Amelia Hartley, who had spent 23 years believing herself invisible, learned that she had never been truly unseen. She had simply been waiting for the right eyes to find her. And once found, she bloomed with a brilliance that no amount of conventional beauty could match. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, even when one person believes themselves invisible, and another believes themselves unworthy of a second chance. For that is the greatest romance of all, to be loved exactly as you are, to be seen for your true self, and to build a life that honors both partners' gifts rather than diminishing them. The forgotten sister became unforgettable. The grieving widower learned to love again, and together they proved that the heart which heals others can itself be healed, and that the truest nobility lies not in titles or beauty, but in seeing the worth in another soul and cherishing it absolutely.